Welcome everyone to session 3. Today's presentation is the School to Prison Pipeline, the Stark Reality in Massachusetts. And I would like to take a moment to introduce Leon Smith, Executive Director of the Center for Juvenile Justice. Leon Smith is a 1999 graduate of the New England School of Law in Boston. He has worked as a trial attorney in the juvenile justice system since 2001. Leon began his career in 2001 as a juvenile court public defender, first in Providence, Rhode Island, and later at the Community for Public Counsel Services in Roxbury, Mass. Leon also served as director of the Racial Justice Project, leading a team providing legal representation to youth of color subjected to harsh school discipline, illegal school pushout, and unconstitutional targeting by law enforcement. Please welcome Leon today. We are so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so very much. And before we continue, I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Ivana Boyd and Kate Lowenstein. If you two could quickly introduce yourself to our participants.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ivana Boyd. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the policy associate at CFJJ.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Lowenstein. I use she, her, and I'm the Multi-System Youth Project Director at Citizens for Juvenile Justice.
Thank you. And the three of us today are going to present on the school to prison pipeline and the fact that the reality for young people is stark, not just across the country, but here in Massachusetts as well. But before we get into that piece, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I want to give a little background on who we are at Citizens for Juvenile Justice. We were founded in 1994 as the only independent nonprofit statewide organization working to improve the juvenile justice system in Massachusetts. We're an independent research and policy organization, and we're really focused on the entire system, juvenile justice, but also other child serving systems that often feed into juvenile justice. And during today's presentation, we're going to talk about that. Ivana and Kate in particular are going to talk about how school systems and the child welfare system contribute to pushing young people towards the juvenile justice system. And our mission is to advocate statewide systemic reform that achieves equitable youth justice. And that word equitable, equity, that's so important to our work because our system should treat all children fairly. But unfortunately, we see disparities that impact children from impoverished backgrounds, children who have disabilities, and Black and brown children throughout the many decision points in our youth serving systems. So first, when it comes to the school to prison pipeline, I think it's important to give an overview of what that is so we all have the same framing. And then we're going to go into data and trends regarding school discipline, school-based arrest, and how that contributes to the flow of young people into the juvenile justice system. So what is the school to prison pipeline? So one of the earliest definitions is the disproportionate tendency of minors and young adults, because of course our young people remain in our K through 12 schools up through 18, 19, in some cases up through their 21st year, from disadvantaged backgrounds to become incarcerated because of increasingly harsh school and municipal policies. But the way we frame it at CFJJ, that school to prison pipeline is really two simultaneous concurrent pipelines that combine to drive students out of the classroom where really a pathway to success in life exists through gaining an education and towards formal system involvement. Those two pipelines, one is school discipline, suspensions and expulsions and these types of exclusions, and the other is school-based arrest. So that school discipline pipeline involves frequent suspensions and even expulsions that remove students from their classrooms. And most importantly, it disconnects them from their school community and the support that should come from that school community. And once they are forcibly out of school, they're far more at risk for juvenile justice system involvement. We know this from studies that say that young people are twice as likely to be arrested or have a negative encounter with law enforcement during periods where they're suspended or expelled from school. And this increased likelihood of arrest applies both to students who have a history, but to students who've had no prior history of delinquent behavior. So many young people have that first negative encounter with law enforcement in the system while they are forcibly excluded from school. Parents are at work and they're at home. Now, the school-based arrest pipeline, and we're going to talk a lot more about this, is when young people are arrested for behaviors that could be better resolved through alternative approaches. Students are arrested and sent into the systems for the behavior may be disruptive, but in many cases, it could be handled through restorative means, therapeutic approaches, or even in some cases through some level of discipline. But it should not be escalating to the point of calling in a law enforcement officer and having them come in and intervene, giving the damage that an arrest has to someone's future arc. So now we're going to ask, does the school to prison pipeline operate in Massachusetts? And I'm going to hand off to Ivana Boyd, who will walk you through this and some other questions around school discipline.
Thank you, Leon. So yes, and it impacts students of color and students with disabilities the most. According to data, we know that Black students are almost four times, and Latino students are 3 times as likely to be suspended as their white peers. We also know that students with disabilities are suspended at 3 times the rate of their non-disabled peers. Studies have established that disparities in school discipline cannot be fully explained by differences in student behavior. Students of color punish more severely for less serious or more subjective infractions. Students of color attend schools that rely more on harsh discipline than predominantly white schools, and behaviors that trigger little to no response for white students often results in severe consequences for students of color. And no, these are not all super serious incidents. Contrary to popular belief, most of these exclusions do not involve criminal or even serious violations. According to data, we know that nonviolent, non-criminal, and non-drug incidents accounted for 2/3, 66.5% of all out-of-school suspensions, and 72% of in-school and out-of-school suspensions and expulsions combined were for minor misbehavior. Consequently, the end result of these exclusionary practices are students missing a significant amount of time in the classroom. The statewide average for the number of days is 16 for every 100 enrolled students. And for students with disabilities, this number doubles to 32 days and is 34 days for Black students. And it's also important to note that the number for Black students is more than triple the amount missed by white students. And
Ivana, can I interrupt for 1 second?
sure.
It's Pat. I was just wondering if you and Leon and Kate could turn your video on so people can watch you while the presentation is going on. Thank you.
Thank you. So continuing, the school to prison pipeline harms our youth. From research, we know that children who have been expelled or suspended from school just once are more likely to be disciplined similarly again, and twice more likely than their peers to drop out of school. And we also know that students who are arrested at schools are 3 times more likely to drop out of school, and more students drop out of school. And once they drop out of school, they're then 8 times more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. So the next 3 slides will give you an overview of statewide discipline rates, particularly looking at students of color, students with disabilities, and students who are economically disadvantaged. So when we take a look here at the data, looking at the student enrollment rates, we see that 57.8% of out of all students, there were 57.8 white students, 9.2% of Black students, 21.8% of Hispanic or Latinx students, 7.1% of Asian students, 3.9% of multi-race, non-Hispanic or Latinx students. There were 0.2% of American Indian, Alaska Native students, and there were 0.1% of Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander students. And then when we look at the statewide discipline rates, we see that Black students were 2.76 times more likely to be disciplined than white students. When we look at rates, the rate disparity between Hispanic and white students, we see that Hispanic or Latinx students were approximately 2 times more likely to be disciplined than white students. And then looking on, we also see that multi-race students were 1.6 times more likely to be disciplined than white students. And then even American Indian students were 2 times more likely to be disciplined than white students. As you may know, economically disadvantaged is DESE's new metric to redefine low-income students. So overall, 25,979 out of 355,902 students who are economically disadvantaged were disciplined. That's about 7.3%. Although students who are economically disadvantaged are overrepresented in discipline rates for students of color were higher. And, oh, sorry, Leon, if you go back a slide, we can just take a look at the rates. So we see that 6.3% of white students, 9.5, 7.9, 2.1. And as you can see, the rates are just they're just much higher than for white students. And then when we look at school discipline rates for students with disabilities, we see that 6.9% of white students with disability were disciplined, 12.3% of Black students with disability were disciplined, 11% of Hispanic or Latinx students with disability were disciplined, 2.4% of Asian students with disability were disciplined, 9.5% of multi-race, non-Hispanic or Latinx students with disability were disciplined, and then 10% of American Indian or Alaska Native students with a disability were disciplined. And now,
thank you so much.
Oh, sorry, I just want to add in one more thing. Also, if you're interested in looking at discipline rates across Massachusetts gateway cities, I will share a link that can be shared with you all just to see how that also plays out as well.
Thank you so much, Ivana. And now we're going to bring in Kate Lowenstein, who will talk about the impact of child welfare involvement, young people who've been subject to abuse and neglect, and the impact of child welfare involvement on educational outcomes, as well as that same flow into the juvenile justice system. Kate?
Hello, everyone. First of all, it's too bad we can't see you all. I have been an attendee at this conference for many years, and I've always loved it and gained so much from it. So I'm honored to be able to do a presentation. So the work that I do at CFJJ is to look at the feeder systems and the causes within those systems of pushing young people into our juvenile justice system. And so you can see here that there's this overlap of foster youth and foster youth in schools particularly. And so the school to prison pipeline for foster youth is like the pipeline on steroids. It's just every measure there's additional layers. And I recognize that this slide is a little bit dense. But I actually I originally put it together for our juvenile court judges to try to really emphasize. I'm not sure if the 3 red people really helps, but I think you all have this in your handout, but it is important to walk through just how deeply sort of impacted our foster youth and the discipline rates and the disparities for them, how they do in school show up in our Massachusetts foster youth. So 75% of foster youth change schools when they first enter care, which, right away, there's we know for children, the stability of schools is incredibly important for how safe they feel and how they can learn. 34% of the older youth have had 5 or more than 5 changes of schools. They're 2 times as likely to be absent, 2 times as likely to be suspended, 3 times as likely to be expelled. They lose progress, academic progress. For those among you who are the special ed surrogate parents, as I am, none of this is really news to you, but it is so important to see it overall. The other pieces that are very important are that children in foster care with an IEP are more likely to change schools more frequently, more likely to be put in restrictive settings, and have poor quality education plans than their non-foster peers in education. And then there's the issue of the dually involved, which I will get to in a moment, but those are youth who are DCF involved youth that are also become involved with our juvenile justice system. And we know that at least 70% of Massachusetts youth in DYS have a diagnosable mental health disorder, which we can very much relate to trauma, multiple traumas. So let's move on, I guess, to the next slide. This is important. Oh, I just want to make sure. So can the panelists still see that? Maybe you can answer in the chat, can still see the slides. It looks like some may be having a problem. If someone could just say if they're still seeing the school discipline slides. Okay. All right. See, at least Faith is with us. Okay, great. Okay, great. All right. So this is the next few slides are from a report done by the courts. So this isn't just our data. We'll get to some data that I used. Oh, I'm sorry, that may be my fault. I'll carefully read out loud that the writing is fuzzy. Some of my slides don't translate when I put them into different presentations, but this was a snapshot in 2019 of the overall disparities between foster youth and regular students, non-foster youth students. And so, yeah, I can see that this is pretty good. But so I want to say also that these slides were pulled from this report. And so the reason that there's only 3 race ethnicities is because that's what the report used. There are, obviously there are far more nuanced and incredibly important ways that we capture demographics, multiracial youth, Asian youth, indigenous youth are not, but I'm, as I said, I'm trying to show you what the court itself did, its own evaluation of how foster youth are doing. And that report is also available. But as you can see, all Massachusetts, there, 64% white, 9% Black, 18% Latinx, but students in foster care, those proportions change significantly. 17% of foster youth students are Black, 27% Latinx, 44%. So those flip down. Next slide. So, oh, I'm sorry. Did I skip the discipline slide, Leon? Sorry. Can you go back one? Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, go next. Yep. So this one. All right. So this is to also, again, give you all a sense of what we know about youth and care. And this is from 2020 data. And the orange bars are youth on the caseload under 18. The purpose of the pie chart was to really show you all that the majority of our foster youth are school aged, right? 6 to 17 years old. And that's to just really get a good understanding that when we're talking about foster youth, the majority of them are in schools or even on the caseload, as you can see. So they may still be at home, but they are experiencing child welfare involvement. So that's really what that is, because I feel that it's important for people to understand an overall sense of what we're talking about. Okay, next slide. So here you can see the disproportionate discipline. And again, this goes to, as Leon and Ivana were showing, that the discipline in school is directly a part of the school to prison pipeline, right? So you can see that foster youth, who are the youth with the orange yellowish bars, have 2 and 3 times the rate of discipline and school suspensions as all students, which is, it's quite stark if you look at that. Next slide. And here, the disparities are even worse. So these are the dually involved youth. So CFJJ, we did an in-depth analysis of dually involved youth. And part of that was to try to understand what cause we know from the data that over 70% of our DYS youth had experience in foster care. And then when we try to also understand where some of the problems arise, we know that school is where many of trauma-related issues can come up, right? So schools, as we all know, schools are a key measure of well-being in general. They're also where trauma-related behaviors show up and are likely to be punished rather than treated. So as you can see, the dually involved youth across the board do even worse in every measure than the foster youth, than students in general. So they were also experiencing, the purpose of this is to really understand that, what we all know, which is that for too often, any student or any child with trauma sends off signals of distress, or we could see that there was smoke long before there was the fire of discipline or expulsion or even school-related arrests or school-based arrests. And we have to look at the initial signs so that these disparities, this disproportionate impact on their education experiences, that we have to work to lower those. So actually, Leon, if you don't mind going to the next one and then coming back to this one. The next one this is an important study, which again, you may all know about, but you can see that this was a study done at Harvard showing that foster care alumni had PTSD diagnoses at double the rate of Iraq War veterans and almost double the rate of Vietnam War veterans. And again, this is not news to most people that understand complex trauma, the trauma of child welfare involvement. So there's the trauma of what was experienced in the home, and then the trauma of removal. And what we know is that Massachusetts, we have a very high rate of youth bouncing around in foster care, particularly when it comes to Black and Brown youth. And what we also know is that there's a disproportionality of Black and Brown youth involved in our child welfare system. In fact, the state population of youth demographically is flipped inversely in terms of our youth in foster care. So Leon, if you can go back to the trauma piece, and this is the last slide on specifically on the foster youth, but this applies to any youth that have experienced trauma or multiple traumas. But the traumas that come out in the classroom not only are barriers to learning, they're barriers to being able to self-regulate, they're barriers to, as we know, youth with trauma can either shut down, in which case they can be punished for not participating, or they can be dysregulated by even the slightest sense of discipline or correction, which is very, very natural to a brain that's experienced multiple traumas. But what we really need is full understanding of that experience without labeling foster youth problems. We have to understand trauma and what its impact on the brain. And we have to understand that too often when we see trauma in Black and Brown youth, we are far more likely to react with punishment, over discipline, or school-based law enforcement than we are with the support systems that those youth need. So those are the ends of my slides.
Thank you so much, Kate. And so we've given a framing of that school discipline part of the school to prison pipeline. So now let's shift to school-based arrest. And the conversation around school-based arrest has to start with the fact that we have very little transparency. The Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2018 explicitly, intended to ensure that we had adequate data showing the number of school-based arrests that were happening and basically showing how that part of the pipeline operated. However, there's broad non-compliance with that law, and we currently are dealing with a lack of adequate data on the number of school-based arrests that are happening here in the Commonwealth. Only 31 of 289 school districts reported any school-based arrests in the 2018-19 school year, which was the first year that data was reported. And this was really troubling. The Office of the Child Advocate noted that many of these districts had not taken the appropriate steps to define the appropriate role for both schools and law enforcement in collecting this data. And furthermore, at CFJJ, through both filing our own public record request and connecting with our contemporaries at the Committee for Public Counsel Services Youth Advocacy Division, they did a file review and found that districts who were reporting very few or no arrest, their attorneys had large numbers of arrest. And this map shows the pieces that are colored are the only districts in Massachusetts that reported any school-based arrest. And again, we're talking drastic undercounting. Just a couple of quick examples. In Springfield, we sent a public record request and we knew they had 44 school-based arrests for the year in question, but yet the reporting to DESI showed 0. Boston, reported 6, but in a Boston Globe article cited that they had 114. So a major issue is we need to have an accurate counting of the number of arrests to really determine the full impact of the school to prison pipeline. Now, we can't talk about entry into juvenile or criminal justice without speaking about the role of police in schools. The presence of police in schools is a major factor in the school to prison pipeline, not just nationally, but also in Massachusetts. And having police in schools has led to an increasing criminalization of young people, particularly young people of color, often for relatively minor transgressions, as we stated before. And this is an issue that's being talked about on the local level across the Commonwealth, and is currently being discussed before our legislature as we speak. Some of the different layers of this issue, one involves investment of funds in where we direct resources to. Often when people talk about the merits of police in schools, they say, well, these officers, they're like educators, they're like counselors or social workers. And in many ways, that's really misleading, because in many of these same districts, you see a major underinvestment in funding, hiring, and training actual social workers and counselors and other social and emotional supports for students to fulfill these roles. This is especially damaging in districts where you see a significant population where a lot of families are dealing with trauma. These kids are going in, and as Kate explained, they're bringing this trauma into the classroom. You have an underinvestment in those support services, and you have someone with arrest powers who is there instead. But another piece of this is that if you have an actual counselor or an actual educator in that space, they're legally obligated to protect the confidentiality of a student who comes to them needing help. No matter how nice or well-intended a law enforcement officer is, that same confidentiality protection does not extend to a law enforcement officer. And so you have students who are given the illusion that they have this confidentiality in a conversation with a law enforcement officer when that really does not exist. And so really quickly, and at the conclusion of the PowerPoint, I'll put the link in the slide, but we released a report recently called FAIL, School Policing in Massachusetts, that really addressed how police in schools contribute to the school to prison pipeline. What we found in engaging in the debate around police in schools were often beliefs and decisions about the pros and cons of placing police in schools. They were really fueled by emotion or a lot of what ifs. And we said, well, let's just take a look at the data and the research and see where things fall. Beyond the common narratives that people say, really, what factual information do we have? And I'm going to quickly just share some of the findings that we had in that report. So our research showed that there's considerable evidence that the presence of a police officer increases school-based arrests for low-level nonviolent behaviors that traditionally have been the domain of school disciplinarians. For those of us who are older, we remember a day and a time where two kids had a disagreement, engaged in a shoving match in a hallway, and maybe it was just broken up and they had a conversation in the principal's office, or maybe they got after school detention. Now having an officer, those are assault and battery charges, and those kids are being introduced into the system. Because simply having the option of calling in a law enforcement officer often results in these type of incidents, being referred to law enforcement, resulting either in arrest or a summons to court. And data backs this up, where we know nationally, schools with police officers reported 3.5 times as many arrests as schools without police. So the difference in there's an SRO in the building versus are we going to call the SRO to come in for this, much more likely to have those arrests happen when you have an SRO in the building. Another finding of our research is that there's considerable evidence that Black and brown students and students with disabilities are disproportionately singled out for arrest and criminal citations for relatively minor conduct. And looking specifically at Massachusetts, focus groups with SROs from a range of school districts, from urban school districts to smaller town school districts, have shown that that line between behaviors that warrant school discipline or an alternative approach versus those requiring law enforcement intervention, it's really blurred. And what gets considered criminal or worthy of a police officer coming in, it varies from district to district. And sometimes within a district, it varies school to school. And the end result of this inconsistency is a bias against Black and brown students, which is evidenced by the fact that Black and Latinx students are 27% of the students in Massachusetts, but 64% of the school-based arrests. And when you overlay race and gender, those disparities are even more stark, because we see, when we look at girls in this school to prison pipeline issue, Black girls are not just 5.5 times more likely to be suspended from school, but 4 times more likely to be arrested and referred, and 3 times more likely to be referred into the law enforcement system. So, and it's interesting, Mass Appleseed did this report along with their fellow Appleseeds from Kansas and Alabama. And the shock was that Massachusetts rates of disparity for Black girls were worse than those in those other states. But to me, really the starkest, and when you're asking yourself, well, why is the school to prison pipeline so damaging? It's damaging to the very reasons why we want kids to go to school and overall the setting that we want kids to have. We want kids to perform well academically. We want them to have a climate that's conducive to learning. But there's a growing body of research that shows that regular interactions with police officers in and out of school has a harmful impact on students' academic performance, especially true with Black students who exhibit signs of trauma, up to and including anxiety and PTSD as a result of these interactions. But placement of police in schools also has a detrimental impact on the overall climate of the school. Again, especially true for Black and brown students who have expressed in a number of focus groups that their overall sense of safety is not increased by the presence of an SRO. We know this because in evaluation of the impact of federal school policing grants, they took a look at those schools and they found an increase in discipline, decrease in high school graduation, and a decrease in college enrollment in those schools, which achieved grants to increase the presence of policing in schools. And just 2 more quotes along those lines. School police placement led to an increased reliance on surveillance, more frequent illegal searches and seizures, inappropriate sharing of confidential information, encouraging students to inform on each other, and an emphasis on formal control that created an environment of fear and distrust. Again, the presence of police leading to a harsher and more punitive environment leads young people to being less likely to open up. as the second quote shows you, having police in school actually reduce the perceived legitimacy of police, decrease trust, and really we talk about trauma and all of this that kids are bringing in, especially during this time of the pandemic where kids are coming into school situations with more trauma than ever. Students actually end up being less willing to confide in school staff when they're experiencing trauma. So there's that carryover effect of just having that law enforcement impunitive factor in schools. So that brings us to the conclusion of our formal presentation. We wanted to get through because we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions that myself, Kate, and Ivana are more than happy to answer. And if we come up against time, there are emails, and you can certainly reach out to us after the presentation as well.
Thank you, Leon. I just ask if Leon and if you and the other panelists could just put your videos on, that would be great so everybody can see us. And there are some questions in the Q&A. This one I think is kind of a two-part question about school resource officers. So I'll give you the first and then the second. It says, please let us know how your organization feels about school resource officers. I think the person asking the question has had some mixed reactions to them with regards to students in foster care, especially non-white students. So.
I mean, what I would say is I in no way take away from the fact that there are, I've done this work for 19 years and I've encountered both, as an education attorney who goes into schools and represents kids in special education and school discipline matters and in the juvenile court. I'm not discounting that there are some school SROs who go in, they want to be there, they make a great effort to connect with kids, and those individual positive situations are there. However, when you look at it as a system, as a whole, and you look at the overall impact of having a mandate to have policing in schools in Massachusetts, the impact is not positive. It's a situation where, again, as the slide stated, these punitive outcomes are not applied fairly, they're applied disproportionately, and they're applied more often. And it has led to more young people going from a setting that should be their springboard to success in life into the system. And we have to realize one arraignment, one day in detention, once a kid gets into the system, touches the system at all, it greatly increases the chance that they end up on a life path that's resulting in failure rather than success. So again, we heard the individual stories. We wanted to look at the data, say as a whole, is this a system benefiting young people in Massachusetts? And based upon the data, we do not support police in schools because of that research that we've done.
Okay, and in a follow-up to that, someone just asked if there are maybe specific examples of outreach that are underway to change this situation in the schools where the SROs are present.
So currently, before the legislature in the conference committee, there are two bills. There's a House bill and a Senate bill. That Senate bill has a provision that would alter Chapter 71, Section 37P, which is the state statute which mandates that there be an SRO, and that SRO is chosen strictly by the chief of police with consultation with the superintendent. It would take that decision out of the province of just the chief of police and say, in order to have an SRO in schools, it would have to go before the elected school committee, and the school committee would have to approve that each year. And as a part of that process, one, it gives a forum for parents to come and young people to come and state, this is how we feel about how the SRO is performing. But it also would require that school-based arrest data that is not being collected, that would have to be shown so we can show like what's actually happening, how many kids are being arrested, how many kids are being referred to court. They would also have to present money, how much money is being spent on school police versus how much money is being spent on support services. So it would create a transparent process through an elected school, and really would put the power of that decision more in the hands of localities. So if the citizens, if the parents of children are not happy, they would have that avenue to challenge that. If people were happy, then they could keep that, but it would take it from this is something that we mandate, and it would really give much more flexibility for districts to, it would bring more accountability, because each year you have that performance and you have public accountability for the performance. So that's one thing that's being done. Also, we and our colleagues at Mental Health Legal Advisors, we convene a group of local level advocates, most are parent-led, of folks all over from Western Mass to Southeast to Greater Boston to the North Shore, who are pushing to remove SROs from schools. So there are active local-led movements. As a coalition building organization, we bring people together to share thoughts and share ideas and share research. But this isn't something that, CFJJ is parachuting in and pushing. This is something where we've taken the lead from parents and young people who are saying, we want this to happen.
Right. I think that's so valuable for advocates to know that there is a place for them where they can network with each other and work together. And we had a question that might be a little bit of a follow-up to that, and just saying, asking what other things maybe, or what should advocates be thinking of doing? So I think you've already offered one solution. I don't know if there was anything else that you think advocates can be doing in the field to help with this.
I think the first thing is, on this issue of transparency, if I'm a parent in a school district and there are police officers, I deserve to know, are those police officers arresting kids? Are they sending kids to court? So I think pushing for transparency. We are one of a few organizations that if parents reach out to us and say, we don't know, we will file a public record request to try to get that data, while also working with the Office of the Child Advocate and others to try to tighten up the system so that we have that data better. So I would say getting that information, and honestly, it's going to your local school committee saying, these are the experiences of my children in my neighborhood, and really just continuing to speak out. The last I would say is that collective, we call it the Statewide Connection on School Policing. If anyone knows of a parent group that's interested, please email me. My email was on the end of the PowerPoint, and we are happy to connect you into that community where from Greenfield to Lawrence to New Bedford to Boston, there are folks having that conversation. And really the best way to be informed is to be informed by other amazing work being done on the local level.
Yeah. So another question we have is a statement and a question. The information about the school to prison pipeline in Massachusetts astounds me. I thought we were far more advanced in solving these issues. Does your organization work with the State House to get more money for services for kids at risk?
So we do engage in coalition building through our Juvenile Justice Coalition. We're also involved in another coalition called the Chapter 222 Coalition that looks at education issues. So we do advocate on the legislative area, and we are certainly open to doing a campaign around budgetary issues. If that's something that folks on the local level are interested, ultimately we take our cue for what we do legislatively from our coalition partners who range from being providers to local advocacy-based organizations. So what I would say, if that's an idea that someone wants, please connect with us. Our legislative director is currently having stakeholder calls and talking to people to determine what next legislative session will entail. And we're certainly all ears to do everything we can to address, because, and Kate and Ivana, please chime in, but the most jarring thing of the school to prison pipeline is that you have kids who are in these systems that really should be helping them and giving them support and lifting them up. And unfortunately, they're actually sweeping kids further into the system. And we want kids who've been abused, neglected, who've endured trauma to get that help when they need it.
And I might just add one final piece, which is that everything we do at CFJJ has a legislative component. So but what we really want to make sure is that we're data driven. So it's fact driven. And then it takes the conversation. So there's so much conversation, particularly during COVID, about mental health and children in schools and children in schools experiencing mental health issues and families as well. And the challenge to all of us, and I know that this whole conference is addressing that, is how do we keep doing better and how do we continue to evolve the conversation to where we are as a society? And the conversation that we are having as a society is we have got to root out systemic racism at every single level. And that includes in our mental health system, and includes in our schools, and it includes how it all interacts, and doing just one or the other doesn't get at it, right? And so I think that that the part of that answer is yes, we use everything that you see here, we try to bring to our legislators. We always need more connection to them, because the more our legislators understand the bigger picture, the graphs and the maps, hopefully the more it infuses their decision making and the legislation that they bring. But it also requires people in the public to pressure them as well. So we do our best to inform the State House, to inform legislators, to pull the data together, to make it visual. But it also takes you all who are advocating for children with special needs, who do this work so much, to go to your schools and demand better, demand that we change our mental health system so that it's not 50-minute sessions once a week, especially with foster kids who move around and they lose any relationship. We have to keep evolving what we do for kids to support them outside of the adult perspective, outside of the white perspective, the white middle class perspective, and take into account what has been happening historically and what is happening now, and do better, always do better.
So Pat, if I could jump, I was looking through the list of questions, and Kate, I think this would be a great one. I certainly have a perspective, but I'll offer to you first. Someone asked, why are children of color receiving less referral to mental health services? And I know that's something that you've done a lot of research on.
Right. So we look, so this is hard to quantify directly, but, so there's many theories and conversations. We know that the talk about a different pipeline, our mental health services pipeline is very white. And what we've got to do is start training more clinicians, more therapists. We have to have the mental health system reflect everyone who comes to it and needs it. And it also needs to fully, it can't just be trauma informed, it has to be culturally affirming. And we know that too often, because historically it's been dominated by certain race and ethnicity, the mental health system, we know that first touch with a mental health clinician, if it is alienating, if it's not affirming, people are less likely to come back. And then of course we know that there's stigma. So it may be that youth of color, or we know that foster youth can be referred to a mental health system, but this experience does not support or get to what they are needing. And then they're more likely to reject it, less likely to be able to form a bond. So there are so many pieces of that we're all responsible for doing better. We're all responsible for making sure that person that the child goes to see for mental health, that they seek out, if there is a referral, that is also for the whole family, that it is something that is trauma informed, but not just like a 2-hour training, because we know that you're not trauma informed fully just with one training. So I'm not sure I don't think that there's one answer. I think that there's many. It's another pipeline that gets broken along the way.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, there was a slide earlier when Kate spoke on trauma in the school to prison pipeline. And I really think we need to really go beyond just a definition of trauma and really teach teachers and people in the school building what trauma looks like and how it manifests. So that kid who's hypervigilant, that kid who, has that negative thinking and isn't participating because why am I even going to try? You're only going to think I'm a bad kid anyway. And just the inability to self-regulate, those are characteristics of trauma. And I think what happens getting to the racial dynamic, and, there was a period in my career where as an attorney, I was taking pro bono education cases in an urban district, and I was being paid to take cases in a wealthier suburban district. And it was so stark how kid with trauma in a wealthier district, the first thought is, well, what's happening? What's going on? How do we help this kid? It was instantly in that frame. I drive 20 minutes into an urban district and the first thought is, this is a bad kid. Why is this kid acting up? And the first knee-jerk response was to punish. And I'm like, why am I having to advocate and make the case that this kid has this trauma? These are two kids, both exhibiting similar characteristics, but the knee-jerk response with poor kids and kids of color is to first say this kid is a problem. Whereas oftentimes when you're dealing with white kids, and especially kids of a higher socioeconomic background, the framing is, well, this kid is having a problem. And that really determines instantly. And that's something where you really have to train and get people to look at their implicit biases and not have a knee-jerk response when a kid acts out.
Yeah. So another question, I think it's at the bottom of the Q&A. It just says, do you think use of this information, I think meaning the information that was presented today, is helpful for advocates to use or families to use in disciplinary hearings or manifestation determination reviews? Or do you think it makes people defensive? Or is there a way that this information can be framed to be helpful, I guess, in those situations?
Absolutely, I think it has to be framed. So the comment I just made of, looking at it. So, when you're in that manifestation determination, a lot of times the school is coming in and they're going to literally sit there and talk about every single negative thing about this kid that's going on. And I think it's so important to go and reframe that through a trauma lens and say, what supports have we? First things first, and it's interesting in the special education context, doing special education with kids who've been juvenile justice involved was always really interesting because I would be working with the kid and I get the education records and I'm like, oh my God, how has this kid never even been evaluated? Whether the kid's identified or not, but a lot of times that labeling of the kid as the bad kid starts in 3rd or 4th grade. And then your 9th grade, 10th grade, and this kid's never even been evaluated to determine if they need those supports, despite both academic failure and just a long history of repeated suspensions. So that's the first thing. But even if your kid has that IEP, is that IEP appropriately tailored to meet that young person's need? Because, in some cases, it's just they slap an ED designation and this kid has other needs. They have multiple disabilities. They have academic shortcomings that are aiding in frustration. So, absolutely, I think looking at things through the trauma lens is really important. And I understand it can make, schools defensive, but if you're in a school district where it's very clear that kids who are acting in a similar fashion are being treated differently, sometimes you have to call it for what it is.
Okay, thank you. There was another question, which is interesting. It says, in one of the slides, the term was used economically disadvantaged. And the person was saying that's such a better term than low income. And maybe why either you chose that or that is now, a more preferred term. Maybe you could just address the use of that terminology, I think is the question.
Yeah, so that's actually a new term that DESI is using to differentiate from low income. The new term allows DESI to report data on all schools and districts who are participating in the community eligibility program, which incorporates as a provision for high needs students to serve free meals. So that's where that differentiation came from.
Okay, thank you. So, and then there was a question, I think, about, I think you were talking, it was at the slides where you were talking about the reporting of arrest numbers. But the person was asking, that's when the question came in. So, but the question was about, how has COVID impacted some of these things? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it hidden? What do you see going on?
We're asking that very question right now. So with our fellow advocates, you know, ourselves and a number of other organizations did send a letter to DESE saying, you know, kids have gone through unthinkable trauma during this time. You know, there was educational disruption when the pandemic first hit. And when you look at a lot of our cities and towns in Massachusetts that already had a significant population of children who were enduring trauma were also the hardest hit by COVID.
Yeah.
So they've been dealing with income inequality, housing instability, sickness of relatives, in the home. And so a letter has been sent to DESE saying you really should issue some guidance. Similar guidance in other states, Illinois and Connecticut off the top of my head have said, you should really only discipline kids as an absolute last resort during this time, giving all the extra trauma that's going on. And we're hopeful that they will take a similar step. But the truth is, you have a definition of an out-of-school suspension or an in-school suspension, but if a kid's in online learning and they're plucked out of their online classroom and they're isolated away in a breakout room by themselves. Sounds like a virtual in-school suspension to me, but is it going to be recorded that way? I think we're going to be collecting information and learning throughout this year, and really at the end of the year trying to figure that out, while also getting information from parents and young people this year to be able to inform that.
I think you're muted, Pat.
Thank you. So I think we've answered all the questions. I just want to give 1 minute if anybody wants to add another question. Okay, thanks.
So I just put
I think
our school to prison pipeline page in the chat, and it encompasses all of our work, the tremendous work that Ivana does around school discipline, our school policing work, all of that can be found there. And again, myself, Kate, Ivana, we're all very passionate about this work, as you can see. If there's any questions you think of later.
I think I have one more, Leon, that just came in, if you don't mind. It says, it's in the Q&A, and it says, do you feel that this will become a much larger issue once the housing moratorium is over? Oh. Oof.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can't help but. I mean, Kate, sort of touched on that, but when you have kids don't have stability in when they're placed and when they're moving around and they're bouncing around school to school and they have these needs, it has an impact on education. Housing instability will lead to just increasing trauma for young people. And the question is, do we have adequate support services to help young people address this trauma so that they're able to come into a school setting, be it virtual or in person, and learn? And where those support services are inadequate and more young people are coming with those types of traumas, it's going to be very damaging. And it's something that I think is an advocacy community as a whole, from those of us taking individual cases and working with individual families to those of us doing policy work, we're going to have to really pivot to meet the needs of young people and families as this pandemic stretches on.
Thank you. So there's just one more thing. Someone asked if you could share the link for the discipline rates. Maybe if it could go into the chat, or if you want to share it with us and we can share it with people. So that was it for questions. So I'll let you wrap up, and then I'll just wrap up with some business items.
Yeah, so I would just quickly say the school to prison pipeline link you have there, when you go to the main page, there's a little map of Massachusetts. When you click on that, that brings you to all the discipline rates.
Great.
And other than that, just thank you guys for inviting us in. It's really been our pleasure to speak with you all, and feel free to call on us anytime. We definitely appreciate the opportunity to really share on these type of issues that have such an impact on young people.
So great. Thank you very, very much. This was so helpful to our members. And I know that we have your information and the information was on the last slide, and I'm sure you would love to hear from anyone. So thank you. Thank you very much for being with us today and spending time. So for everybody, thank you to the participants for coming today. It's so funny not to be able to see you as I'm thanking you, but so just a few things. The link to the session, to this session's evaluation is in the chat. And if you would just fill that out for us, we would really appreciate it. And if you would check back on the homepage, there's also a conference evaluation. If you would take some time to fill that out, it really frames and helps us form what we do the next time. So that would really be helpful. So this was very powerful again. We all learned a lot. And thank you very much to everybody for their time. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.